So Annika, listening to and watching your presentation brought to mind figures like Picasso and Bala and Picabia and Dubuffet and Braque. You know, you had them all on screen for a moment, and I started to get worried about the operative definition of avant-garde that we're working with that seems to have largely bracketed many of the, even the central avant-gardes that would get named as sort of the classical or heroic avant-gardes of the 19 teens and 20s. You know, so Cubism, of course, but then Dada and Surrealism also largely haven't had much, made much of an appearance in the last 2 days. And I wonder, maybe this is a question that I'd just like to pose to everyone. Why not? What then is being sort of set out of bounds if in a 2-day conference about the avant-garde we seem to never have really addressed very deeply Dada.
That's probably a question for the organizers, right?
Well,
I don't know, because
these were your papers. Come on.
yeah. I mean,
but you invited us.
There is an answer. Some claim that there was no Dada in Poland. Like in this kind of strong sense. Yeah, we of course knew about Dada. I don't know. We printed an article by Schwitters and so on and so forth. But there was Neo Dada, of course. Yeah, like in late 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on and so forth. And Dada was for us a kind of invented tradition. Yeah, Daniel spoke about Józef Robakowski, and Robakowski was kind of inventing his own Dada already in the early 1960s by having a look at different English language books in Toruń at the university library. So he was creating for him exactly an invented tradition out of which he could develop his own Dadaist works. Okay, so this may be one answer to your question, and Daniel's answer is also a good one. These were your papers, so our papers. So. Okay, so thank you.
Well, of course, when you're invited to a conference like this, you try to figure out what could be the relationship to what you're working on with this situation, and this is a quite new angle in my research, but it's very clear that the dominating idea of modernism and avant-garde was the French, was Cubism, and I tried to describe what it looked like, but I have no answer directly to the reasons, of course, the proximity and the Iron Curtain and stuff like that, but it's still strange.
Something that I didn't really go into at all was the collection also in the architecture and design department of graphic ephemera and poster art, and from as early as 1936 the museum was acquiring major works from Jan Tschichold, and then actually funded by Philip Johnson subsequently the larger collection of his graphic ephemera, which certainly have a strong Dada strand in them, but generally the exhibitions of figures like Schwitters and even really in the bar exhibitions have been generated from more of the painting and sculpture or drawings and prints department, and really not examining the more commercial applications of the whole Dada strategy.
And maybe also I should add as the organizer to your question that some of you know already that this conference is like first step in this long-term project that will continue through next year and will be finalized by a publication in 2019. So we started with the conference, and then Avant-Garde Museum or Museum of Avant-Garde will continue with more papers, more researchers coming.
Is that okay? Julian, I think it's also that it's avant-garde, not historical avant-gardes, the conference. So I think that creates a lot of room, actually, for people to ignore Dada. Say, not that I'm for that, but I just think there's a lot of stuff going on here. I mean, a lot of material to choose from. I have just a couple of questions, and I'm going to try to be as short as possible. For Annika, I was really interested. It was towards the beginning of your talk, and you talked about because you sort of theorizing this, or discussing this idea of reenactment. And you sort of used this phrase, which was great, the performative gesture through exhibition. I don't know if you remember. Yeah? I'm sorry. I mean, just that I grabbed that, and I wondered if you might just a little bit, talk a little bit more about that. I found that really intriguing. And then, Juliet, I was really, you presented this, for me, super interesting survey of all these shows and looking at the different sort of directors. And I just loved that slide you had of all those women who did all the work. But what else is new? But my question to you was, I was really struck. When was that show where they had the sort of things for $10? What year was that? About? That was one of the so-called useful objects.
It was 30s, right?
Which was a series, like Good Design, from 1938 to 44. And actually during the Second World War, in fact, I think it was the 1943 one, the title of the exhibition was Useful Objects Under $10.
Right.
I mean, the price is actually in
because it's partly to do with the war and shortage and all that.
Yeah.
Okay. So
but also building off the demand generated, I think, from the machine art exhibition for just more information about what things cost, where you could get them, how to actually build on that experience of the exhibition and participate as a consumer.
Because my question was, do you see a kind of development or an arc of ever-increasing emphasis on commercialization by the mid-50s, the sort of shaping of the 1953 sort of reshaping or emphatic shaping of the commercial world?
Definitely Johnson felt that Kaufman was going too far,
right,
along the
right.
commercial route. And I mean, I think it's no coincidence that Kaufman comes from a retailing background.
Right. I just wondered if you wanted to sort of step back from all the moments, and do you have is this an example of actually the beginning of the Cold War? Like the greater and greater emphasis on the commercial efficacy of the museum or of design or whatever being part of a historical discursive response to, what happened in the Second World War, the division of Germany. I know it's a gigantic picture to draw, but like we're among friends. It's not like it doesn't have to be biblical truth. Just does it.
Yeah, I feel kind of ambivalent about it, but actually, in some ways, I find it really quite refreshing. I'd almost like to go back to a position where we could, in the gallery, put prices of things, or just be completely transparent about what it is we're doing. And actually, in some ways, I think the retail environment, the design stores, which are run from within the organisation. They're not franchises, and the money comes back into the funding of the whole operation of the museum. But I think it is, in some ways, a recognition of where MoMA is in New York and our consumer culture, and I think that needs to be acknowledged.
Annika had mentioned when the museum had requested a show of Native American art to be sent, and then they sent the big guys, the big guns, the big Ibex generation. And that, you know, if you follow the sort of social art history, they talk about that as an example of Cold War aesthetics. So my question was, I was trying to sort of think about shifts in the exhibition of design and the stepping up the game on the commercial. I don't mean the $10 thing, because I see that as very modest and fabulously interesting. I'm thinking more of the Kaufman angle, you know, into the early 50s, that's kind of stepping up a game in the context of the formation of the Eastern Bloc and so on, because it's only 1949 when that happens. The division of Berlin, etc. Yeah. So that was more like, it was on a, like, is it a rhetorical position that's an index of the Cold War and its extraordinary impact, in the way that, you know, Eva Cockcroft's old essay about Abex as a manifestation of Cold War aesthetics. That was my.
Yes, and in a sense, I think it's the area of design. Which is even more powerful in that Cold War context than Abex.
I think maybe it gives me an indication to replace. I under-theorized maybe my conclusions in a way when it comes to the formative gesture of an exhibition, while I believe that those projects that were presented from the Museum of the Wishes onto the other examples show, there are several ways to show this, but show how eager Moderna Museet at the time were to play the avant-garde card, but also to be an artist, not to be an institution, that deny that fact that they actually were an institution in all these different kinds of ways, by help of referring to the early avant-garde and also including American avant-garde, although the local artists in the generation of the pop artists were not very welcome at the museum itself. So there is a certain East and Western sort of. But then you showed very well also that how MoMA worked with the design and internationally, and so it's very interesting examples that you showed us.
I just wanted to ask Juliet about. I was thinking on this parody image of MoMA, like all these white men, straight, most of them, I think. Not all of them, but well, Alfred Barr was straight. And then this other image of all these white women that are beside them, like doing the work, like this circulating exhibition, for example, department that had been so important in this idea of canonizing everything, you know, what is Native American art, what is design, whatever, and that demonstrates in a way like how MoMA has been a very patriarchal and a very racist institution from its base, you know, especially when you show this first Afro-American designer, like what happened with that, you know, at the end. But my question at the end is nowadays, beside like the post project or all this like quotation system of including Eastern Europe art or Asian art or Latin American art, in which way today MoMA still works or not? That's my question. I internally in the same patriarchal and racist ways, you know, internally as an instructor, and also in the exhibition and public program system.
I mean, I think it is these are dimensions of the legacy of which all the curators, staff in MoMA, I think, are really self-consciously aware. And certainly there's been a sustained initiative, a museum-wide initiative like the CMAP one, which is trying to look at networks, different geographic regions. But there's been a modern women's initiative, which is not just for curatorial staff. It's actually looking at, women's roles and working environment and contribution at all levels and areas of the museum. And there's I suppose I think our workforce and the internship program is definitely becoming more ethnically diverse, and through initiatives like the Art Speaks program, which involves people working in all areas of the museum, speaking about what art means to them. And that might be one of the cleaning staff or a janitor or the director of the museum, but speaking to their experience of works in the collection. So, I mean, there are these kind of initiatives, I think, that are really shaping, the current programming and activities.
To rectify historical exclusions, to collect African-American designers alongside.
Sure, there's a very, that is a strategic priority to acquire more work in those areas. So, I mean, it is a case of trying to be strategic in the gaps that we're addressing, because we can't do everything, and we can't change the collection overnight. But that's something which is debated and, carefully.
W MoMie zdarzył się taki artysta, który wystawiał swoje prace bez przynależności państwowej, tak jak niektórzy sportowcy, którzy nie reprezentują żadnych państw, tylko dla samego sportu. I też dla pani ze Szwecji, czy też... Bo
ja będę musiała przetłumaczyć, bo oni nie mają, więc może po kolei ja powiem im i zaraz pan będzie kontynuował. I will help you out. So the first question is to you, Juliet. If in MoMA there were cases that artists were being exhibited without obvious link to their nationality, as in sports. And now there will be another question to Annika.
Podobno w MoMie tylko wystawiał jeden artysta z kraju. Znaczy z Polski.
That was the follow-up to Julia, that possibly there was only one Polish artist exhibiting in MoMA, and now I'm going back to...
Tak samo jeden artysta z Polski, myślę to świętej pamięci Tadeuszu Kantorze, który wystawiał...
There were a huge number of Polish artists exhibited in MoMA, not least in the area of poster design, which was, I suppose, one of the ways in which was a kind of Polish response to this kind of Cold War exchange, this kind of graphic design that excited audiences, designers in the US and Western Europe. And it was a very powerful tool in that sense. And Daniel, I think, as part of our collaboration, you also have experience with Paulina of many of the Polish exchanges and artists who've been represented at MoMA. But in terms of citing nationality for artists, it's not something that we do particularly well, I think, in that the convention in our cataloguing system is to just identify the country of citizenship of the lead designer at the time of death. So, you know, in the case of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, he's American, although he took citizenship just a couple of months before he died. And, you know, actually crediting people with multiple nationalities, or actually indicating the nationality in a sense of the artwork, is something that our cataloguing system just doesn't allow for.
I want to emphasize that there were a lot of networking between Poland and Sweden that is about to be researched. One of my colleagues at Södertörn University, Camilla Larsson, who is sitting there working on Tadeusz Kantor and all his shows in Scandinavia in the 1970s, for example. Although those shows were not at Moderna Museet, but still at municipal konsthalles like Kulturhuset, for example. So we have to dig that up a little bit also.
May I ask you about possible influence of new Cold War? Is there any traces of this, or not?
In terms of Russia, we have this trust for mutual understanding, which is specifically to fund continued engagement, you know, with scholars and artists, and you know, partnerships with Russia. Although the actual you know, where it really bites is in terms of arranging loans, as Daniel knows too, in both directions. But the actual personal contacts, I think there's a very conscious effort to keep those channels alive.
Yeah, in terms of Cold War then, I mean, we are in some kind of war state maybe now, but then I think those examples where the American art was sent to Europe and to Stockholm was a part of the Cold War, sort of, and to win over the minds and hearts of the Europeans in the culture war.